Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Frank Rhodes lecture. My name is Minu Ai, Vice Chair and Managing Director of the University Design Institute. And on behalf of the organizing team here at UDI and the ASU community, I'm delighted to also welcome Dr. Alondra Nelson, who will deliver our lecture today. Before we get to a formal introduction of our scholar today, I'd like to share a little bit about the lecture series itself for those of you who are joining us for the first time. So Dr. Michael Crow, president of Arizona State University, created the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series in 2011 in honor of Frank Rhodes, who served as president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1995. Frank Rhodes is considered one of the most impactful presidents of the 20th century, who was driving a vision to fundamentally change the education and cultural landscape of higher education. During his almost 22 years at Cornell, he changed the course of the university. His unfailing drive and persistence to bolster student and faculty diversity was amazing. The diversity on Cornell's campus increased with the number of women and minority faculty members doubling, and the percentage of minority students on campus nearly tripling. Research funding increased from 88 million to over 300 million annually. And he led a successful fundraising campaign to redesign the Cornell landscape for generations to come. In 2001, Frank Rhodes published a book, Creation of the Future, which discussed the responsibilities and possibilities of American higher education. And his ideas were an important influence in shaping the new American university concept here at ASU, led by Dr. Crow. So through this lecture series, we honor Frank Rhodes and his vision to shape US higher education. Our scholars are leaders and experts who each in their own fields and in their own ways are pushing the evolution of 21st century higher education. They're individuals who have and are boldly advancing ideas, forcing us all to think about what we should be doing within our university and within higher education more broadly. So these lectures are meant to inform, inspire, and educate us and support the ongoing transformation of ASU. A couple of housekeeping things before I turn this over to Dr. Crow. The lecture is being recorded. Please feel free to share the lecture with students and others in the community and beyond. The lectures will be housed on the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series website at ASU. After Dr. Nelson speaks, we will have time for a discussion, about 30 to 40 minutes. So please add your questions and comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will try to get as many questions as possible when we get there. And with that, let me turn this over to Dr. Crow to formally introduce Dr. Nelson.
Well, thank you very much, Manu, and it's really great to have Alondra here, Alondra Nelson, who's Linder Chair at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey, and also heads up the Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab there. Alondra is a rare individual in the sense that she's a person who's operating at the highest level of science implementation, science strategy, national science strategy, having been at OSTP and done all kinds of other things. And she brings a blend of scientific understanding with an even broader blend, if you will, of understanding American trajectory, American culture, the trajectory of the United States, all these kinds of things. And so what we usually like to have in these lectures is intellectual architects. And Alondra is definitively a leading intellectual architect about where the United States is going from our scientific and technological foundation. You know, the first republic to have intellectual property owned by its citizens, the significant advances that we've made in mass education at the university level, the land-grant schools, the emergence of the research universities, all these things that we've got going on, all of which are powerfully important. And so Alondra brings to the table the most difficult skill imaginable, which is not what do we know in science and technology, not where are we going in science and technology, but what does it mean? And what do we want to achieve with what it means? And so what I'm hopeful of in our design of this new American university here, this design of this new kind of institution, is that Alondra can fill us with design and aspirations, ideas about where we're going, where we've been, where we need to go, and then what we need to ultimately achieve, which I know she is intimately familiar with, which is it's kind of funny, one of my colleagues when I was at Columbia on the faculty there, Phil Kitcher, talked about science, truth, and democracy, and he helped me to understand that science in and of itself is immoral, amoral, I should say, is amoral, and that in its amoral self, we have to then guide it to become what we want it to be, to achieve the moral outcomes that we want our republic to enable us as individuals and as a society to be able to achieve. And so Alondra is coming in as a truly broadly scoped intellectual thinker and designer to help us all to think about this. And so welcome, Alondra. We're very excited that you can be here and come in from Princeton and meet with us and help us to continue evolving this new American university idea.
Well, thank you so much, President Crow, for that incredible introduction. Thank you for the invitation to join this important lecture series that means so much to you. It's a real honor to be, in the line of participants who've lectured in this series, and also to honor a transformative university president, not unlike yourself in the process. So absolutely delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So, and Minu, thank you for those welcoming opening remarks, and I look forward to the conversation that you will help us to generate. So, I think President Crow gave the headline. I mean, I want to challenge us, I think, today in our conversation to take our eyes off the shiny object that is AI, shiny, fun, awe-inspiring as it might be, and think about the world that we want to live in and how we want to use AI to achieve that world. So let me begin by just first sort of setting the table, level setting a bit about what AI is. So this is a definition that comes from the OECD, which is a multilateral international organization, doesn't include every organization in the world, but nearly 40 quite important nation states. And so this is adapted from that definition, which is that AI is a machine-based system that infers from input it receives how to generate outputs, including predictions, recommendations, decisions, or content. So content, we're probably more thinking about generative AI, things like ChatGPT, which became familiar to many more of us in the fall of 2022. Predictive algorithms, recommendation algorithms is the kind of AI that we've been living with already for many years and didn't actually give much thought to, I think some of us, unless you're working in that space as a technologist or otherwise, before November of 2022, when ChatGPT really came on the scene and sort of transformed from being AI really transformed in that moment from being a kind of business to business tool or something that hummed in the background of our lives that we maybe thought about from time to time when Netflix served us a recommended movie that didn't make sense and we thought, what's going on with that algorithm? Or when we got autocorrect in our iPhone when we were trying to send a text and it was just wrong. Those were the kind of day-to-day interactions we were having with AI into fairly recently. And in the fall of 2022, we get a consumer-facing product, lots of, and soon after, several of them in the guise of these chatbots that really sort of brought a conversation about AI well into the mainstream. So I think that moment is important for democracy and for all of us participating and thinking about the way we want to live with powerful new AI tools and systems. That moment was a heady moment. I think, there was a moment of hype. It's plateaued a little bit, but it was also a moment in which many of us for the first time had to say, hey, how am I thinking about these tools, or how should I be thinking about these tools? Okay. So obviously, a lot of the excitement around AI sits under the category sometimes of what's called AI for good. And, there's some real potential here. So there are applications like AlphaFold, which was developed by Google DeepMind, which is able to predict the structure of proteins and potentially has all sorts of outcomes from medical applications, as well as applications in sort of biomanufacturing and the like. So potentially incredibly powerful, although those applications remain to be seen. Obviously, AI has already proven itself to be really helpful for accessibility and for giving additional support to the disability community. Some of you might be familiar with Waymap. Now, that is since 2017. You know, this London-based company has created these different sort of maps for different cities and municipalities across the world that allow people to navigate their world, even if they're sight impaired or otherwise have challenges getting around in space. And they're also useful for other people as well. So that's an application that's already happening, and I think will only get more powerful and more useful with the addition of advanced AI. And of course, AI for efficiency. So AI promises to help with crop surveillance, help us to grow healthier crops, to know what's going on in sort of the large space of big agriculture, and obviously potentially to feed more people as we need to in this world. So, but none of those things are just going to happen. And we've already seen that we've got quite a few challenges with the use of both predictive AI and generative AI. And so these, I just pulled over some headlines over the last year. You know, they fell in love with AI bots. A software update broke their hearts. 8 months pregnant and arrested after a false facial recognition match. How AI-powered tech can harm children. UK cybersecurity agency warns of chatbot prompt injection attacks and more. So these are, will AI harm benefit or harm workers? These are things that you're familiar with. So if we're going to get to the AI for good, I think much like President Crow was suggesting, we need to be clear that the AI for good is not inevitable, that it is not an inevitable characteristic or an inherent characteristic of artificial intelligence models, tools, and systems, right? That these outcomes that we want using these tools to augment our lives in different ways have to be stewarded. They have to be created by us. And that starts first with vision, and then with creating various pathways, including policy pathways for reaching those. So we've seen, you know, concern in Washington and elsewhere about this. What we saw early on in the first 6 months of ChatGPT being introduced in Italy, it was banned over privacy concerns. President Biden says that, you know, tech companies have to ensure that their products are safe. Washington variously is vowing to tackle AI and the like, all headlines that you are familiar with. But all of this sort of hue and cry about what should we be doing about AI begs, of course, a bigger question about how we should be doing it. What is the right way to regulate AI, or I would say govern AI? So this is from a foreign affairs article that I wrote earlier this year, a few months ago, that was published in January. I didn't choose the title, but glad to be attributed with offering a right way to regulate AI. And part of it is indeed to focus on its possibilities and not its perils. So I wanted to return to my title of my talk. I'm going to spend some time talking about how we might think about governing the future, how we have a vision for doing that, and how we sort of do that in process. And I'm going to talk through what I call policy innovation, and then some democratic participation involving both us as you know, political actors in the world, and also us as citizens of colleges, universities, and communities in higher education. So policy innovation is, like other forms of innovation, can be disruption, but it's also trying to imagine how to get to yes. So when I was working in Washington, D.C. in the Biden-Harris administration in the first 2 years and couple of months, what I found, one of the things I found most fascinating was that generally the answer to everything that you were trying to do in Washington, the policy space, was no. Like it was, you know, it's too expensive, we've tried it, it's failed, give it up, don't try. And so the question for a policymaker is, how do you get to yes? And part of that is sort of thinking about innovation. And the innovation can come in how you frame the question. It can come and what the outcomes or the practices or the policies that you end up with, and lots of things in between. But it starts with orienting and anchoring in the vision of what you're trying to accomplish in any given policy. And this is true as well for thinking about issues around AI and AI governance. More principally, I think for this administration, in particular, I was watching earlier today, President Biden had in Syracuse, New York, an announcement about a partnership with Micron, which is a semiconductor company. And part of what the policy innovation around AI has been around the actual material things that we need. How do we get the semiconductor supply chain back in the United States? How do we enable the creation of GPUs, memory, semiconductors, other kinds of semiconductor chips that we need if we're going to grow this ecosystem? So all of those today was announced, I think, a $6.1 billion partnership with the Syracuse community, with Micron, a company there. And Micron, in turn, talked about its investments in education, how it is building pipelines and pathways from rural communities, tribal communities in Idaho, also in Syracuse, through community colleges, through job training programs to colleges and universities. So government is always making investments, and even in the space of the sort of larger AI ecosystem, policy innovation can mean imagining making those investments in a way that invests in communities, right? If you're going to be spending money in science and technology investments anyways, one could say, spend the money, see what happens, and, hope for the best. But I've been struck by James Webb, who was, he wrote an interesting kind of memoir / kind of management book after his time leading NASA, in which he said, if we have the choice to think about strategically how we're going to make investments and how they can be a tool for policy to enable opportunity for people, to enable jobs, education, and the like, why would we not also take that strategically opportunity? So part of the policy innovation that we should be thinking about around AI is about the hardware and the software and the math skills and the soft skills that are needed, and how investments in those can also enhance people's lives. So that's part of how we want to think about, I think, governing the future. That's perhaps different from how we might have approached it in the past. I want to also suggest that we're often presented with choice architectures, and I'm sure we'll have a question about this in the Q&A, and we should talk about this, but that we can either have, innovative technology, or we can have technology that, doesn't harm people, doesn't enhance risk, right? That we can have innovation, or we can have safety for the American public. And we are in a kind of early stages of AI development. As exciting as it is right now, we're very much at the beginning. And this is very much an opportunity that we can say these things are not mutually exclusive. And moreover, that true American innovation means that we're going to actually figure out how to do both excellent technology and do it in a way that keeps people safe. Policy innovation means as well that governance doesn't prevent innovation, but can enable it, right? It can offer sort of ballast that provides stability, that provides a kind of controlled range of motion for industry actors. You will have heard, I think, over the last year, increasingly, tech entrepreneurs saying, we need some regulation, right? I mean, there's obviously, I think, a limit to what any entrepreneur or startup founder will want with regards to, not innovation, regulation, will want with regards to regulation. But I've been struck over the last year that there's been a real call for a sense of like, what are the rules of the road? How should we be, I want to be competitive, but how do I compete in a system that feels quite unstable? So governance and the work of government is in part to offer this kind of stability and a controlled range of motion. And that too is a kind of policy innovation. So I think the more surprising aspect of policy innovation I want to offer for you as a way of thinking about the future is that we often think, particularly in the space of technology policy, that we're governing the object. So you can think about things like the telephone or other forms of technology in the 20th century in which we created regulatory agencies around a particular object, right? I think AI, a tool so powerful, a tool potentially general use, right? Use for a wide range of spectrums in society, a wide spectrum of uses in society, means that you can't try to govern the object, right? It's also, if we're thinking about generative AI, and we go back to the definition that I adapted from the OECD, we're talking about tools and systems that are iterative, that are dynamic, that are changing. We're talking about deep learning systems that are sort of taking in data and learning and changing, as they develop. And so to have a sort of way of thinking about policy that's about the object actually is just insufficient in kind of every imaginable way. So what does this mean? It means that technology policy means, returning to first principles, returning to a fundamental vision of the public good and how we want these technologies to help us get there. In the brass tacks, the kind of, bread and butter of policymaking, which we won't go too much in the weeds there this afternoon, it does mean that existing laws, rules, norms, and standards apply. So if a type of a use of if something is permitted and you can do it using AI, it should be permitted in that way as well. If something is illegal, forms of discrimination against folks in the disability community, let's say, if they're seeking employment, whether if you use AI to sort of sort people out of a hiring pool, for example, and it would be doing that, having a person do that would be considered illegal. The same rules apply. And then I think it's also a moment to think about then having, I think, return to first principles, thinking about existing rules and laws. Then we can think about what new rules, laws, norms, and standards we might need. So the headline here is really that we don't need to reimagine the social compact every time we get a new transformative technology. We have fundamental things that we agree upon, and those things should be true, even as the technology is moving quickly around us. So I'm going to offer two examples of how we can think about doing this in practice. And I think, and centering the sort of role of democratic participation in the middle of this. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project called the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that I worked on when I was working in Washington, and the sort of how that project has traveled, its origins, and how it developed and how it's traveled. And then I want to say a few provocations about the 21st century university in response to my great admiration for what President Crow has done with the New American University, and for our further thinking and for our further thinking about what this kind of AI moment means for how we need to think about the work of the university. So in the fall, a month before ChatGPT was released in October of 2022, the Biden-Harris White House released the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights with the subtitle, Making Automated Systems Work for the American People. So this was this was a form of policy innovation, right? So it wasn't formal policy, it's a white paper. It's about 70 pages long, offering some ideas for how we might think about governing AI. And moreover, how we might think about regulating and governing AI if our North Star in policymaking was making sure that these systems worked for the public. If that's your priority, how do we need to be thinking about that? So we spent, let me go back and then forward. We spent a year, we did an op-ed in Wired, in which we sort of called to the American public and we said, how should we be thinking about AI? What are the rules? What are the systems, the processes that we need as an American public if we're going to make AI work for us, this powerful new tool to be the kind of workhorse for progress that I think, when I'm at my most optimistic, think it might be in some instances. How do we get there? And so we sent a call out. And we had actually even an email address that went to the White House, so anyone could weigh in. We inaugurated about 9 months of public engagement. We had listening sessions. We had town halls. We had panels on different sort of topics about different use cases for AI. We talked to high school students, including an incredible group of students who started an organization called Encode Justice about their concerns about and aspirations for the use of AI in American society. We talked to rabbis and priests. We spoke with lots of people in industry. lots of industry alliances. We, of course, spoke to many academic researchers and just members of the general public. And what we came up with, go back here. Let's see if I can go back to this slide now, was a distillation of best practices, of sort of principles and also practices. And I think these are fairly common sense things. And the document was really written at a level that anyone could read it. So we worked very, very hard in the drafting of this document to make it free of jargon, to make, have any jargon that we used have a definition that was clear. We wanted it to be used and circulated and thought through as the public, the American public, was beginning to think about AI. So these are the 5 AI, this is the AI Bill of Rights. AI systems should be safe and effective. You should have protections from forms of algorithmic discrimination, whether that's in the workplace or in medical uses and elsewhere. That there should be some modicum of data privacy. And some of you might have been tracking that we now have a draft federal data privacy bill that's bipartisan and bicameral that I have great expectations for. That there should be notice and explanation. So you should know in many cases when an AI system is being used, and you should be able to get an explanation about how it was being used. And then that you should have human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. So again, this is about particular use cases. The AI Bill of Rights has been taken up in different states, and I'll say a little bit about that. So for the human alternatives, the state of California has legislation that uses the phrase, I think it's substantial decision. If a substantial decision is being made about your life, then you should have, this definitely have a human alternative. Okay, so let me move forward here. So the AI Bill of Rights came out in October of 2022, a month before ChatGPT was released. It's been taken up all over the country. It's been taught in high school curriculum in California and Massachusetts. The state of Connecticut by summer of 2023 or 2022 actually had passed legislation that was signed by the governor Ned Lamont that tasked the state legislator with advancing a Connecticut AI Bill of Rights. As I mentioned, the state of California had a bill last year. There's another assembly bill this year that is attempting to advance the AI Bill of Rights as part of a large suite of legislation that's happening in California around technology and tech accountability. There's an ongoing bill in the state of Washington, and I am particularly proud and inspired of the work that's happening in Oklahoma. So this is the sort of bipartisan, I think, work of the AI Bill of Rights. When you ask people to think about what the stakes are of technologies for their life and how they want to sort of think about them in their lives. So we now have introduced by a Republican state legislator in the state of Oklahoma, something called the Oklahoman AI Bill of Rights. You'll see here that some of these are echoes of what was at the Biden-Harris AI Bill of Rights. So the right to know when you're interacting with an AI model, to know when your data is being used, to know when your contracts and other documents were generated by an AI engine rather than a real person, the right to know when images or text were generated entirely by AI or not reviewed by a human, the right to approve any derivative media that's generated by AI, the right not to be subject to algorithmic or model bias on a whole range of categories from veteran status, religious belief, to age, race, disability, and sex. So it's really been taken up in language that people understand, the stakes for, how do they want AI to sort of augment their lives, live in their lives? How do they want AI to be used, and how do people want AI not to be used? So I want to pause here because I think we've not, as I said at the beginning, it's really been the introduction of ChatGPT as a large kind of, a public sort of, in some ways, firestorm, but in some ways also just a public excitement around it that brought the general public, the broader public, into this conversation. And I think it also raised the stakes about AI governance and issues about AI and technology being also issues of democracy, meaning that not only those of us who are experts in science and technology policy like President Crow or experts in STEM can speak on the implications of this technology that is going to impact, I think, all of us and hopefully have, beneficial, positive transformation for many of us as well. So another beat on the democratic participation. So I think what the potential of AI means for us is a kind of reimagination of the university, in part sparked by the great work that you have been doing at ASU for many years now. For example, so I want to sort of, I'm putting two books covers here that probably won't be familiar to many of the students in the audience, but others will be familiar. The one the one on the right, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, is a kind of foundational document of the organization that I'm a part of. I'm in the faculty of an organization called the Institute for Advanced Study, as President Crow mentioned. It was founded by education research reformer named Abraham Flexner, who was a very important 20th century figure in the sort of progressive reform space. And it's an extended essay, and effectively he says, we need to let people just do blue sky research. Like, people just need to dream, they need to be creative, they need to ponder, they need to potter. And out of some of that might be something that's actually useful, but who knows? And so part of the institute where I'm at was really established to be a sort of engine of this like useless knowledge, like people just here purely for creativity. On the other hand, about 30 years later, 25 years later, Clark Kerr, who was the president of the University of California, would publish a very important book called The Uses of the University. And here he talked about what we now understand to be, in many cases, the modern American university, right? It has graduate school, it has undergraduates, it has professional schools. There's often collaborations with the federal government through grants with, NASA and DARPA and NSF and the like. And there's, increasingly sort of engagement with technology transfer and sort of getting the knowledge of the university out into the world for forms of innovation and sort of commercial production. And so we're offered in the contemporary university, I think, these two I think they've been presented often as polarized ways of thinking about what the research university is for or what it could do. And I want to suggest that we need to be thinking about sort of a combination of them, and that AI, particularly issues of AI that are both about the use of hardware and software in organizations, but also about a tool that's going to change the very ways we think about knowledge and sociality, requires both of these perspectives at the very least. Another way of saying this, so there's the National Science Board, which is the sort of governing body of the U.S. National Science Foundation, every 2 years puts out something called the Science and Technology Indicators. And I was really struck this year by the large uptick in business investments in research and development, right? So this is from 2000 to 2021. You can look at the significant increase in business contributions to research, right? So federal government is still contributing, but a lot of the money is coming from R&D expenditures are coming from the business world. And arguably, I mean, this is science and technology indicator, so arguably really from big tech and from the labs that are doing work in Silicon Valley and sort of ancillary work. So the question become, so this brought for me a lot of questions about the 21st century university. One that I think is that I want to highlight is that there's a lot of research in the university that doesn't get picked up in the science and technology indicators, right? There's humanities research, there's social science research that's not here, and is likely still heavily funded by the federal government and by the sort of more traditional ecosystem, which says to me that the university has a very important role to play in two ways, right? Both in multi-sector collaborations that allow researchers to work across business, across government, and I think new and innovative ways. Some institutions are, of course, have faculty who are appointed across business and across the research university. But it also means, and particularly at a moment we were trying to think about AI governance in a way that that prioritizes the values that we care about and that we want to anchor in as we're governing. It's centrally important also that we think about what's not on this chart, right? Which is all of the other research in the university that's centrally important, and all of the sort of education of students, and that wider spectrum that we talk about as the liberal arts tradition, right? That's both very applied job skills, but also critical thinking skills. One of the things that we, if you've been following the literature on, what's going to happen with jobs, and you think about the headline I showed you earlier, what's going to happen with jobs as AI gets more powerful and impacts more of our lives. So, obviously jobs will likely be displaced. It's possible, that jobs will shift around, and it's also highly likely that we will have lots of new jobs. And what some of those new jobs are going to be, we're already seeing some of this, right? So, things like prompt engineering, right? Things that require critical thinking skills, a kind of creativity in how you pose a question to, an AI tool or system to get it to, output something that might be helpful for you. So even as we're showing S&T R&D going up in laboratories, and I think, one way of looking at this is like, oh, the other investments are flat. I think we also want to think about the other investments that are being made in research that are going to be so critically important at a moment where critical thinking skills, design skills, creativity skills are going to become all the more important. Some of those are, intersecting with STEM skills and things that we're tracking and S&T expenditures and S&T research, but some of those are not. So this is the photo that accompanied my foreign affairs piece that I've just been captivated by, because it doesn't look like a future that we want. With kind of robots looming over us, and then the rest robots looming over some of us, and the rest of us, I think, standing around not caring. That's probably not the world we want. So I've been encouraged to be able to work not only with, since leaving Washington, in a lot of international communities to think about how we can anchor AI governance for global good, in an optimistic way, with a hope for AI for good, even as we understand it's not just going to happen and it's going to take a whole heck of a lot of work. And so we don't have a world that looks like this slide, somewhat dystopian. So just to end, and this is my last slide, I've been encouraged by the work that I've been doing in these spaces. So I have the great honor of being a member of a United Nations high-level advisory board on AI. We released an interim report in December of 2023, and we'll release our final report in late summer. And it comes to our interim report in part, comes to some of the same conclusions of a UN resolution that was adopted, that was introduced by the United States and was adopted by every member state in the United Nations, 193 member states, which, if you follow at all geopolitics in the UN, that rarely happens. So signed on to this resolution. And what did this resolution say? It effectively said, our AI governance is going to be anchored in and going to be oriented by the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations Charter, right? The fundamental, to go back to my earlier point, the fundamental things that we agree upon that are our North Star for how we want to use these tools and systems. There's obviously, there's also more practical things, like there are the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has given. We've given ourselves homework to reach those goals by 2030, and we're not quite there. And there's hope that the use of AI can help to accelerate those, particularly with things like agriculture, helping to mitigate and understand climate change, helping to improve healthcare for people and the like. But to just sort of think back to, what does it mean for the 21st century university? Governing AI and getting our society ready for the transformations that might be coming, but certainly the impact that is going to come, is going to need all of the STEM talent, all of the folks working on AI, all of the great programmers and engineers for sure. But it's also it's becoming very clear that we're going to need people who have expertise in human rights, who have expertise in the law, who have expertise in thinking about societal change and sort of political economy and the like. And so our sort of headline, I think, for the 21st century university is certainly that STEM matters. And it shouldn't be a kind of dogfight between STEM and the humanities, but a real understanding that governing AI for humanity, as the United Nations interim report is titled, will require that we almost return in a new way. So a renewed return to a university that takes up lots of different skill sets and lots of different perspectives and methodologies as we move forward using universities to really be an engine for transformation for individuals, for family, and for society. Thank you.
Alondra, thank you. A lot of food for thought. You can see all the little claps and the thumbs up going on the side of the screen. You've given us a lot to think about. It's important that you've held space for this, for recognizing that it's a moment of stewardship, whether through policy or other mechanisms, because we are looking at a future that we all don't completely comprehend. And we loudly and clearly hear your call for universities to step up and be part of the solution here by educating our students, the research, multi-sector collaboration. So we are going to be paying close attention to the details in your lecture as we move forward. To our participants, please continue to add your questions. I see some in the Q&A already, and I will start taking them. But Alondra, let me start with sort of what's exciting for you as you think about AI for public good. What are a couple of things that you're excited about?
So I come to AI having worked on human genetics, and human genetics was one of our first big data puzzles, right? So you decode the human genome, you have all this data. The Human Genome Project was, a project that was not just the Department of Health and Human Services, but the Department of Energy, which has they even then had the largest kind of supercomputers in the world, right? So compute and data was always central in genetics research. And so I'm very much watching what's happening in the space of genetics and the space of thinking about healthcare applications. So I think that's pretty interesting, but a lot of that still remains to be seen. And so I think, one of the cautions that I often offer to audiences I'm speaking with is that we can still be quite excited about the potential without sort of getting ahead of our skis with the hype, and so, I'll remind some of you, you'll be familiar with this, that the computer scientist Jeffrey Hinton in 2016 said, in 5 years, there'll be no need for radiologists, right? So here it is, 2024. Not only do we need radiologists, but the implication being that the AI imaging will be so good that it will replace radiologists. So here we are in 2024. Not only do we still need radiologists, we have a global shortage of radiologists. We don't have as many as we need. And it's been demonstrated that how the AI is useful is not in replacing radiologists, but in augmenting them as being a tool and assistive technology in the work. And so I think we often in the early days of technology go to, we can be extreme in our excitement. Like, we're no longer going to have X, we're no longer going to need Y. So I'm excited about applications of the technology to improve medical care for more people, but it must be done working with clinicians, medical professionals, patients to figure out, this is also the work of things like, human-centered computer design and sort of machine-human interaction, also very important fields that we've got to figure this out and move beyond the sort of hype cycle. I often get really excited also about the applications at places like NASA that have been, one of my favorite NASA projects of recent vintage was the DART mission, in which we demonstrated that if there was a sort of asteroid kind of cascading towards Earth, that we could intervene by casting it off of its trajectory and saving Earth and saving all of humanity potentially. But all of that was done with tremendously sophisticated, neural networks and deep learning around modeling of these different kind of orbits and trajectories and the like. So those applications are really exciting as well.
There is, as you can imagine, a lot of excitement in our community about the possibilities of AI. And I think there are also concerns, and your lecture really pointed to some of the governance pieces. And as I look at the questions posed by our participants, there are multiple questions, but there is one that seems to be woven across multiple threads. And I'm going to read one question to capture the idea. Is how can governance provide a stable foundation for growth? So the question is, given the iterative and dynamic nature of AI, how can policymakers create regulatory frameworks that are adaptable yet stable?
Yes.
This notion of it's moving fast and can government keep up is woven across multiple threads. So what do you think about that?
Good. I'm glad somebody asked that question. It's an important question. I think people rightly ask it, in part because part of the hype conversation also is, you can't slow this down, and if anything you try to do to make it safer or to make it more equitable, right, to potentially beneficial for more people, is slowing things down. So I would offer a couple responses. One, it's important to remember that disruption is a business model. It often the sort of raison d'etre of disruption as a business model is to get around regulation. So when you say, oh, government's so slow, an entire company or industry has been created around going around government. So of course, that is actually the whole purpose. And so of course it's going to, that's going to be what the outcome is and how people experience it. I would also say that it's not government, it's politics that I think that people experience as getting us behind. So I mentioned that right now we have introduced about it in the last month, yet another attempt to get federal privacy legislation. It's bipartisan and bicameral, so I'm very hopeful that we might be able to finally get this done. I mean, the United States is literally one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have any kind of, omnibus privacy legislation. But there have been bills that would have helped to govern or regulate AI, social media for a decade, right? There's actually been good, smart legislation sitting in, this Congress, the 118th, sitting in the 116th Congress. There have been pretty good, meaty privacy bills. So if we think about data as being a kind of foundational piece of the sort of AI ecosystem, and if you can have some governance around data, you can have governance around a lot more pieces of it. We've had good legislation since 2016. We've not been able to get any of it passed. So I think people experience it as government being too slow, when in effect, there's actually policy in the pipeline, often with smart researchers, including academics, helping to develop them. We just can't get them over the political line.
That is a good distinction there. Michael, I see that you are on video. Do you have a question?
No, I think, mostly I think, what we really need to do is we just have to find ways to be supremely aware of where we're going. So it's like, we're in this like fast moving vehicle. The road is a little foggy. We're picking up speed. The things are becoming more complex. And we just need to get people to understand that we're going to have to move at faster speeds, but at the same time be as responsible, if not more responsible. We've never done those two things together. So my question would be, I guess, is, how do we get people to move at similar speeds? That's what's going to be difficult. So technology is moving at one speed. Mm-hmm. Applications are moving at an even faster speed. Social transformation is moving certainly faster than academic transformation. And so all these things are complicated. And so how do we bring timing and clock speed together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm a sociologist first and foremost, so people are slow. I mean, people don't want change. And I think that one of my concerns to go to also Minu's initial question to me is some of the challenges that we might face with getting to the good stuff that AI might potentially offer will present itself to President Crow's question around adoption, right? So we have had right now quite a lot of bad press around AI, such that a lot of the polling data and survey data of the American public says that people are deeply pessimistic. They're more pessimistic than people in India, than people in Indonesia. You know, there have been sort of global surveys and also just that are comparative. And so part of what we need to do is, I think, and this goes back to my my admonition about the hype cycle, tell people practically what these things can do for their life and tell them how they're going to get there, right? We talk a lot in broad sweeps about like, it's going to cure cancer and they're going to do, you know, and that's great, but how is AI going to help cure cancer? And how is AI, if it can help with more diagnostics or faster diagnostic, like what is that going to do for your family? So I think there's just a lot of, there's really important, I think, narrative framing that is going to be necessary to really get people to be curious and willing to sort of lean into the adoption of some of these technologies. And you know, and that in addition to kind of counteracting, I think, the natural sort of caution that many of us have. So I think one way is you know, giving people visions of what might be possible that are, but also realistic, right? That are aspirational, but also quite realistic. That can help people sort of speed up. And frankly, I think some of the, you know, in some of the industry spaces, we want people to slow down. We want them to be more thoughtful, intentional, and careful about the work that they're doing. You know, I think, you know, this is an arguable point, so many people will disagree, but, you know, we've got chatbots in the marketplace now that, you know, probably could have spent a little bit more time being tested before they released, you know, I mean, if we're being frank. And if it wasn't a disruption model that brought them into the marketplace such that there wasn't even an agency that thought like, oh, am I supposed to look at these before they come out? You know, we would be having even a different conversation. So I think that I think everyone could modulate their pacing a little bit, President Crow.
Great, thank you.
Alondra, what you said earlier about the distinction between policy and politics and the need of shaping that narrative speaks to several questions in the chat. I want to bring it back to something you said about democratic participation. So there's a question specifically here about how can we ensure that the development of AI aligns with democratic principles, promoting civil rights and liberties? Because given the potential for AI to impact society, what mechanisms can be implemented to ensure that citizens have a voice in shaping AI's future?
Yes, that's a great and central question. Thank you so much for that. A couple of things. I mean, on the technological side, and part of what we try to map out in the AI Bill of Rights, which has a section that's called From Principles to Practice, are actual kind of socio-technical things that can be done all along the technology stack. And because you're dealing with AI, with dynamic and iterative systems, that you don't just, as you might with a medical device that's being approved by, you know, the FDA, sort of approve it and release it, that there's going to have to be kind of ongoing across the life cycle of AI tools and systems, this kind of work, right? So this is true not only for thinking about alignment with democratic principles or the values or aspirations that we have for the use of these tools, but also about things we don't want, like, you know, racial bias and training sets and these sorts of things. And so you need to think about the design stage, the development stage, and the deployment stage. And there's, you know, the state of the science is not clear on all of this. We're getting better, but, you know, you certainly can do risk assessments, you know, pre-deployment, after things are deployed. There's, you know, auditing or other, you know, red teaming. So there's sets of kind of practices that are evolving and that need to be scaled that can be done sort of throughout. Obviously, with systems that are literally generative, that create, you know, there are going to be instances in which things are sort of output or created that people didn't anticipate. So we're not going to be able to always sort of check for everything. But I think we could do a much better job along that whole sort of technology development stack and asking pro-social questions about, you know, about tools and systems and their development.
So following that, there is a question that's related. So, you've talked about governance and the role of, the government. What about technical solutions that can account for improving the concerns and the quality of these models? Especially the question refers to the responsibility of computer scientists and engineers. So, the non-governmental actors in the system, what kind of models could there be in place for them to be worrying about the same things as well?
Sure. So I think on the carrot, of course, is I think professional accountability and responsibility. I mean, one does not, one wants to have a good reputation of, as an engineer or as a researcher working in these technological, in these communities. So I think part of that is just professional accountability and professional responsibility. Obviously, that's not enough. And I think we have an open question right now about liability. So as we're thinking about as AI tools and systems move from design to development to deployment, and when you think about foundation models like GPT-4, there's now a GPT store that people are building apps on top of. There's questions sort of all along that cycle about who's responsible, and I think we're still trying to figure that out. But I think part fundamentally, in addition to the carrot of be an upstanding, responsible engineer scientist, will potentially be the stick of liability. Who's responsible if a system goes well and poorly. Obviously, there's also a tremendous role for higher education to play. I mean, to have not only political scientists who understand technology, but also engineers who have a broad education that helps them to think through some of the sort of ethical democracy governance issues of the tools and systems that they're creating.
So, you referenced the role of higher education in some really important ways in your talk, and you're back on that right now. What are ways in which you can see universities do things differently or should be doing things differently as we move forward? So there's been a lot of push on STEM education, rightly so.
Yes.
And there's been the not always healthy debate between STEM versus humanities, and that's a poor framing of how things need to be. But you articulated the need for a change across the system in higher education as we're looking into the future. So speak a little bit more about that. There are multiple questions here about the role of higher education. How do you see that in deeper ways?
Great. So I think if we don't, have a renewed vision for, I might say it as this, for higher education after the AI turn or in the midst of the AI turn, that research universities will be left in the position of actually just being the sort of researchers that check the systems that that have to do the kind of police of the sort of commercial AI systems that are put out. So you see, I mean, it's really important research, but I worry that a lot of engineering research in higher education will become testing, correcting things that are released in the commercial space that need or are not quite right, or haven't been benchmarked, and that sort of work. And so I think the challenge that we face in higher ed is both in research is how do you keep open that window of still sort of open design, blue sky, whatever useless knowledge research for researchers in this space, when a lot of the research money is going into commercial applications, right? So we're kind of, that there's that typical sort of, if you think of the image, there's the sort of education, and then there's the trough, and then there's the sort of development and commercialization. So now we're just going to commercialization, right? There's this kind of leapfrog. And so, it's so important to keep the research space rich, but it needs to be not just work that's corrective or benchmarking the commercial work. So how do we continue to incentivize and fund that space is really important. I think we've spent too much time, as I was trying to suggest in my talk, pitting the humanities and STEM against each other. obviously stem cells are vital. I mean, everyone probably needs some of them, you know, I think that that's a truism. But it's also the case that I think you know, as the sort of general purpose AI becomes much more prominent in knowledge work, right? It's not for naught that we had last summer the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America striking very much around the use of AI in their work, because there is some understanding that there is some work that generative AI might be able to at least approximate, if not do it well enough, you know, not do it quite well, based on, you know, obviously in some instances, probably taking copyrighted materials in order to create the training models, which we should also talk about. So that means sort of what is the unique work that we uniquely can do as humans, you know, as human beings, as social communities, and a lot of that is the work of critical thinking. That's not engineering, right? It's about, you know, kind of radical, often, you know, wild kind of creativity, and that's just not humanities versus STEM. That's really engaging. I think critical learning and thinking across how we think about higher education in full, right? And so I don't know if that looks like, I mean, you know, this is your world, you know, is that sort of design thinking in every discipline, right? In every department, is that one way of thinking about it? Is it really, you know, challenging how do we both want students in you know, history classes to, you know, to have a sense of the chronology of how a society has evolved and how we've interpreted that, but also to be able to think creatively about the different interpretations of how we've kind of come to history. So it's a much more, I think we need a much more kind of creative and dynamic way of thinking about higher education, and to get out of the sort of polarized STEM versus humanities, because it's not. And I think we often see, when I was teaching, my first job was at Yale, and I'm a sociologist of science, but also of medicine, as I've mentioned. And there were some undergraduates who came to a group of us faculty and said, we need a new major, actually. Like, we've got a lot of stuff at Yale, but we don't have anything in like health studies or like, and, you know, there was no kind of interdisciplinary at the time, you know, degree around health. Right now, that is one of the most popular degrees that you can get at Yale, but it was something that was started by students. And I think we're already seeing, so the point, to make the analogy to the conversation we're having now, we're seeing with students who are creating, you know, their own degrees that have some engineering and, you know, some art history and some political science and that sort of thing. And so I think, you know, often, as we do and as we should do if we're wise, learning from students in higher education is, I think, also one way to think about it. And I would add to that, you know, the students at, you know, at ASU and other places now are not just digital natives, they're like digital natives. And so there also will be potential uses for these tools, and, you know, I think maybe potential risks that we can't anticipate that I think students very much can, because this is a world that's much more, I think, intuitive to them. And, you know, I think often about, you know, young people being born, you know, since 2022 will like never have known a world without generative AI, which is a striking thing. And like, sort of what is their college university, you know, what does their college experience need to look like? So I have more questions than answers, Minu, but I think hopefully that'll get us started.
I love what you said about involving students, and the idea that could we really think of preparing all of our students to have a design mentality. And if we can layer that on with principled innovation, which is ASU's 9th design aspiration. So there's human-centered design and using the voices of our students, but also preparing our students to go into the world as designers of. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what your disciplinary background was, but can you do that with the appropriate safeguards in place? So important things for us to be thinking about. Another question on universities, and this one cites an example from Imperial College London, which has partnered with TouchCast to utilize digital twins for professors' office hours. And so, you know, as you're thinking about sort of the relationship between the learners and those that are facilitating learning, and the relationship between universities, how are you starting to see AI playing a role?
So I don't know enough about this example to know, actually, this is one I'm surprised I haven't heard of. I mean, I think, I guess a few things. I mean, it assumes that the role of the professor can be reduced to something like a chatbot, right? That looks like you, that who you are, that what we as professors bring to an engagement is, something that looks like me, maybe something that talks like me, and has a kind of chatbot interface. I think I don't. I mean, I could maybe see it potentially working, but I think it would, to do it well, and I think to do it ethically would be so expensive. I'm not sure that it would be worthwhile, right? So you would want to have training data that comes from the professor or from the field, or they're just, so it would be very kind of individualized kind of sort of training of the technology. I think that would be, time intensive and expensive. And, I guess you'd have to sort of do a cost benefit analysis. It's clear that chatbots right now are still quite brittle. They still fabricate things that are inaccurate. And so how you certainly don't, I think whether or not you have a digital twin, the ethical relationship between a teacher and a student remains, and you shouldn't be giving, inaccurate information to students about the teaching subject, or advice about their career and these sorts of things. So I will look up this particular example, but I think that's something we want to be a bit careful about.
Yeah, well, all of us, a lot for all professors, right? We might have to reimagine ourselves as we
Yes.
into the future. And I'm sure there are some interesting and wonderful possibilities there as well. So are there some areas where, given everything that you know and we collectively know about AI for public good, are there some areas where you think right now AI should not get into this? That's one question. And there was another question about students wanting to build a mental health bot, and a professor having concerns about, are we ready to move into that space? So are there some red lines for you right now about where we should not be leaning in versus where it would be more appropriate for us to lean in?
I think we should be, I mean, you asked me earlier what I'm excited about. I am excited and optimistic about healthcare applications ultimately, but I also have a lot of concerns about them. Obviously, this is often people's most intimate information, most sensitive information about them, their bodies, their families. It is not for naught that in the United States, the only real privacy law we have is a law called HIPAA, which is in the healthcare space, right? So we as a society have said, we haven't been very expedient in getting to national federal privacy, but healthcare privacy is very, very important, and healthcare data privacy is very important. And so I worry about the healthcare space. I worry about, there's been some reporting, for example, on healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and others who feel paralyzed in doing their work now. So they're, UC Davis, for example, or Brigham and Women's and Boston. There was some reporting in the Wall Street Journal from a few months ago about nurses who were, had been asked to sort of pilot new generative AI technology and the work that they're doing. And it's led to some, I think, outcomes that are challenging. I mean, one nurse, they're questioning themselves. It's adding friction and in not good ways, I think, right now. That's partly, I think, because the tools were introduced and they didn't spend a lot more time engaging, just kind of doing basic UX and taking time to do that kind of work. But it also suggests that we should be, I think, careful and cautious. I'm both optimistic about things like electronic healthcare records, but also worry about the correlations that might be created and data that we don't imagine around, people's healthcare, right? That can be both good if something's potentially identified that you wouldn't know about, but it also can be, I think, in making inferences and correlations that might not be meaningful about lots of other things besides. So I think there are some, I think where laws can apply, they should apply in the healthcare space. I think that we should leave at least the sort of privacy and ethical infrastructure of that in place. Obviously, I mean, there are things like autonomous weapons, you know, that there should just be a no-go. I think, you know, some uses, you know, the AI, the EU AI Act, I think bans the use of live facial recognition technology. So like real-time, constant kind of facial recognition surveillance, you know, I think that's probably a very good idea. I think, you know, just uses of surveillance and uses of technology that would erode democracy, that would erode social cohesion, I think are real problems. And even if they, yeah, so those are some of the things that are top of mind for me.
Yeah, and something certainly for us to be worrying about. And you spoke about not having adequate protections for privacy, and so there are several questions on the threat of privacy. How do you think about copyright laws, and how do you think they should change in response to AI generated content?
So I don't know, you know, I don't have legal training, so this will just be, you know, me as a interested former policymaker. You know, it is, President Biden signed an executive order on AI in October. It's very long, and it includes asking agencies that work on IP and copyright to take a look at this. You know, this is an instance where you've had a disruptive model that's just gone, and, you know, people have gone and scraped the data, ingested the data, used the data without asking permission. I guess, you know, I'm old enough to have lived through Napster and seen how that, you know, sort of led to Apple Music and, you know, Spotify and new kinds of market models. Even if it's the case that I think most artists would still say that their income and their experience has been quite diminished by that transition. So, you know, that's one possible future that we might imagine for copyright. I don't know how you go back and get payment for copyrighted, you know, data that's already been used. And then we also have the kind of challenge of the international patchwork. So Japan has leaned in, you know, very far into like training data for AI is fair use, and there's no copyright violation there at all, and is actually really encouraging it. So you've got one country that's a pretty big player in the space of AI R&D saying copyright, no problem, you know, we don't see a violation here. And then you've got places like the United States that are still kind of weighing it in the EU, which are other big players in the AI R&D space. So I think there's the copyright issue, which is a formal legal issue. And then there's the bigger issue, which is a democracy issue and an issue about the social cohesion, like what is fair and what is owed to people whose contributions go to make, you know, things that make objects, products, industries that make quite a lot of money for, you know, other people. And we've had, you know, experience of that with social media. And with, you know, people using social media tools, and I think figuring out, and I think some people being okay with, you know, their data is going to be used in particular ways as the cost of doing business with Facebook, with Instagram, with Snapchat, and the like. But, you know, I don't know, you know, if people still have an appetite for that, particularly as it's affecting, you know, creative industries and knowledge industries in a particular way.
So, you know, even as we are sorting through all of the copyright issues, there's also the fact that it's now in the hands of everybody. And there's a lot of creativity in its use, even as people are testing out what the, you know, socially acceptable edges are. So this is a question here that I think illustrates that problem. Would you say that Google Gemini went too far with not giving a picture of vanilla pudding or portraying George Washington as Black? Do you think that that's going too far in the way people are using these tools?
You know, actually, I think that that's, you know, and in some ways how the tools are supposed to be used, right? I mean, these are tools that are supposed to generate something new out of, you know, the things that you feed into them. So on the one hand, the rap that we have on chatbots and other forms of generative AI is that they're not accurate. And it wouldn't be a problem if they weren't being sort of mobilized, particularly including in the enterprise business to business space, as things that are supposed to be accurate, right? So if you're, so that would be fine. And so the you know, in some ways, the point of you know, a generative AI sort of text to image, you know, multimodal tool is to like come up with something creative. That's the point in some regard. So we have these kind of, it's the challenge of having tools that are supposed to take existing things and generate something new, in a kind of business model world in which you want them to be accurate. And so there's a misfit of the tool and the system with how it's being marketed. There's a tool, there's a kind of misaligned incentives between you know, what the tools can do at their best, right? At their best in scare quotes, and also how people now want to use them to write business strategy. And, you know, there's like all of that kind of work. And there's still just a little bit, there's a lot too brittle, too fabricating, too inaccurate to be used for some of the sort of robust kind of factual, accurate things we want to use them for. So, you know, I think there's a kind of political, you know, kind of cultural war calculation to sort of say about Gemini. But I think going up a level of abstraction, it's also this fundamental question about, you know, what's inherent to how the tools work, and the fact that we're trying to make them do things that they can't quite do well.
I like the use of the word brittle in some of these ways that we are experimenting with the tools and the things that are coming out of it. In an environment where we are, you know, where there's a national level challenge at having sort of really good dialogue about these things, how do you think universities can create space for conversations around a Black, you know, George Washington? So how do we take that as an example and engage our students to do the critical thinking that you suggested was only, you know, that was necessary and important? So what role can we play to create spaces for dialogue around the things that are brittle, culturally appropriate or inappropriate, or touching the edges of problematic spaces? What can we do as universities?
I mean, if not universities, where, right? I mean, of course, universities should do that. So I think, you know, I'm not in the classroom this semester, but, you know, the George Washington example, or if I'm recalling, you know, there was also an image of a Black Pope. I mean, those are like amazing examples for all sorts of ways of thinking around that, right? So there's the sort of technological issue. So sort of what, you know, happened, like, you know, what, you know, were these tools tuned in such a way, fine-tuned in such a way to yield this outcome rather than that outcome? I mean, part of the answer we won't know if we don't, you know, without working in the companies, but there's kind of a technological question. And then there's the question of, you know, well, we love Hamilton, so what is wrong with generating a Black George Washington? And, you know, we've got Black Santa Clauses, we've got Black, I mean, you know, George Washington was a historical figure, but, you know, we do have other kinds of historical representations that, you know, look lots of different ways, you know, I think is one way of saying it. So, and that's a kind of, you know, that's an interesting kind of sociology or social science question, sort of like what's at stake in that, you know. Another question I thought that was so interesting, you know, to me about the sort of image of the Black Pope is that demographically, also social science, I think the largest group of growing in Catholicism are people in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And that there are quite a lot of cardinals at the Vatican who are from sub-Saharan Africa. So it is not unlikely that we would have a Black Pope at some point, and probably not in the distant future. So there's all sorts of ways to, I think, that universities, classrooms can uniquely talk about these questions in a way that just gets out of the polarization culture war. I mean, we have to, I think it's unfortunate that, you know, these tools are being released at a time, and again, this is because I lived through the 80s, of another high watermark of culture wars, right? You kind of maybe imagine them being released in like 2003 or something, where we were so optimistic about social media, and like these questions wouldn't have been posed in the same way. So it's also about the social context in the moment and the political moment in which they're being introduced as well. And these are questions that, you know, students and faculty can uniquely ask, because the space of popular discourse is just quite unsophisticated and not a space for nuance and probing.
Yeah, we have our work cut out for us.
Yes.
As professors and universities in this space, wading into the culture wars, but necessary and important to train that next generation of leaders and scientists and policymakers and health professionals and all. Mindful of time, there are a couple of questions that are sort of future focused. In the context of AI being a public good, there's a question here about, do you agree with Elon Musk's idea of having a decentralized AI for each individual to keep checks and balances between AI bots?
I haven't tracked that so closely, but I grok the grok. There we go. The grok, the general sentiment. I think, I think that there's, I would sort of tie it to the debates we're having right now about open model AI. Are we going to get to a place where people can have, systems, tools, agents that can be local on their computers? I think probably we are. We went from mainframes to personal computers, and we will probably go to kind of decentralized agents. I mean, I think we're already cresting into agents. So I think that's probably, and to go back to your question about the digital twin of the professor, I think between the digital twin and the agent, and the potential of open models, we're probably, moving quickly to a kind of decentralized AI world as a possibility, right? Alongside, I think, other sort of parallel ways of doing it as well.
Another future focused question, will universal basic income be catalyzed by known job losses from AI implementation?
So I have beef with universal basic income. I don't have beef in the sense that, like, I think that we need a social safety net for people, period. So to the extent that the universal basic income, can help with that, that's great. But I also think that our thinking around it over the last few years has also let industry and I think government off the hook for forms of social responsibility. So for example, one of the many things I appreciated about President Biden's executive order on AI is that there was a few sections on labor and on the role of government in not just standing by and watching labor displacement happen, right? Including that's happening to creative industries, but actually doing some research and analysis. I mean, the Bureau of Labor, the Council on Economic Advisors, I mean, they have, some of these companies have done some great research. They've got the best data on labor, employment outcomes and forecasting, probably in the world. So how do you use those resources to think about where shifts might be happening? Are there creative ways of using incentives in industry not to displace work in the same way, or to make it happen in gradations, or to incentivize, companies, colleges and universities to sort of partner on upskilling, reskilling? So, what I would hope for, I think that UBI is a very anemic strategy for a future vision for a society that has meaningful work. Meaningful work can be paid work. Meaningful work can mean all sorts of things, but we fundamentally people in society need things that they do in their lives. Our jobs offer us money, they help us pay mortgages and buy food. They also offer us identity and community and social networks and the like. And the UBI doesn't replace that. And so I think there's a real need for government and industry to work together to, really think about all of what employment means to people, and how we're going to work to keep that social cohesion together. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of UBI.
I'm watching the clock here, and I want to squeeze in one last question, but I don't want it to be a negative one. So here's a question. What do you think will be AI's greatest achievement for humanity in the next 5 years?
5 years, short, like, so relatively near term. We'll go back to the health pieces again. I think it will be augmenting, a lot of imaging. So, lots of, like, I think there's great strides in radiology, and the imaging is getting quite accurate, but in interaction with workers, with people who work in radiology. There was a nice paper that came out last month in gosh, I think it might have been Nature Medicine, but I might be getting the journal wrong. That was about the ability of using AI to read images of lungs that have been exposed to COVID-19. So one could have imagined if we had the AI that we have now, or that we might have in 5 years, during the course of another pandemic, at a moment when we were like, how do we know if people have COVID before we had the vaccine, and before we had diagnostic tests and the like. I think that's another potential responses to pandemics more quickly. So I think there are healthcare applications and uses that are coming quickly. I just very much want us to do them in a way that includes people, so we can do them in a way that's sustainable.
Alondra, we are at time. Thank you so much. There were a lot more questions that we didn't get to. You gave us a lot of things to think about. Just take a moment to pause about the broader implications for society through governance, and that stewardship idea that we should all be keeping in mind, and this notion of what we can do uniquely as institutions of higher education in the classroom, around the classroom, and in our interactions with society as a whole. So that was a lot of really important ideas that you were able to bring to our community. Thank you for your time and your energy and your work in this space. We are honored that you were here today with us. We look forward to you visiting our campus, hopefully in the fall, and wish you the very best as you take this work onward and forward.
Thank you so much, Minu. Thank you to President Crow for the invitation. I would love to see the questions. So if you can download those and share them, I'd love to see them. And I hope to see some of you in person next year.
And thank you to everybody participating. Again, the lecture is recorded, so please view it again as many times as you need to, and share with anybody else that you think would find it helpful. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.